Week 36, Overview, The Balkan Problem and American Imperialism. This is the last week of this unit, this year, this century. It's time to tie up loose ends. Dialectic students will continue learning about the early life of Teddy Roosevelt, who was to become the 26th President of the United States when President McKinley was assassinated in 1901. Upper-level students will be reading about several small but important conflicts that flickered around the earth as the 19th century drew to a close. These were the Spanish-American War, the Boxer Rebellion in China, and the Boer War in South Africa. Younger students will have the chance to learn about two men who became famous near the end of the 19th century, George Washington Carver and W.E.B. Du Bois. These two black leaders had very different ideas of how to help their people. George Washington Carver was a devout Christian and brilliant botanist whose story has inspired millions of Americans, black and white. George was an orphan, 6 months old, when slavery was abolished by the ratification of the 13th Amendment. His former masters, the Carver family, raised him and his big brother as if they were their own children. George went to great lengths to get an education. Blacks weren't allowed in school in the part of Missouri where he grew up, but he didn't let that stop them. He walked 10 miles to a Negro school, then moved to Kansas at age 13 to attend a black academy, then spent 5 years just trying to get into college. Finally, he made it into Iowa State Agricultural College, where he was the first black student, then the first black teacher. He slowly gained national recognition as a botanist. Booker T. Washington heard about Carver and invited him to come and teach at his new institute at Tuskegee, Alabama. Carver worked there for the next 47 years, teaching former slaves new ways to farm. The biggest problem Southern farmers faced was soil exhaustion. Cotton had been a king away down south in Dixie since it was first introduced, but cotton takes a lot out of the soil. Carver knew that other plants, such as peanuts, soybeans, sweet potatoes, would replenish the nutrients farmers needed, but who would bother growing peanuts? They were a trash crop, not a cash crop. Carver set about the task of finding uses for these crops. He came up with 300 new uses for the peanut and 118 more for sweet potatoes. He gave God the glory for his discoveries, leading the New York Times to write a scathing article titled "Men of Science Never Talk That Way." While George Washington Carver was serving poor farmers and praising God, another black leader sought other ways of helping his race. Upper grammar students will learn about W.E.B. Du Bois this week, who, according to one biographer, attempted virtually every possible solution to the problem of 20th century racism: scholarship, propaganda, integration, national self-determination, human rights, cultural and economic separatism, politics, international communism, expatriation, and Third World solidarity. Du Bois never wavered from his desire to help black people, but his efforts to do so led him down some ugly paths. Your children's books don't emphasize the dark side of his life, but he admired the Japanese imperialists, visited Hitler's Germany, called Russian dictator Stalin a great man, and traveled to Chairman Mao's China. He joined the Communist Party at the age of 93, then gave up U.S. citizenship to become a citizen of the newly independent African Republic of Ghana in 1961. He died there, just 3 years before America passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We'll spend more time on civil rights next year, but that's getting ahead of our story. Let's turn back to the election of 1896, where Republican William McKinley became America's 25th president. McKinley was well qualified for the job. He had joined the Union Army at the age of 18 in 1861. He fought in the Battle of Antietam, where he was recognized for his valor and promoted. By the end of the war, he became a battlefield brevet major. After the war, McKinley became a lawyer, and he practiced law until 1877, when he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. He served there until 1883, and again from 1885 to 1891. As a congressman, he believed strongly in protectionism and supported the highest tariff the country has ever seen. That cost him re-election in 1890. He ran for governor of Ohio in 1892 and won. In 1896, McKinley was nominated by the Republican Party to run for president. During the campaign, he upheld the gold standard in opposition to William Jennings Bryan, who supported free silver. By the 1896 election, the American press was beating the drums for war with Spain, which was cracking down on its rebellious colony of Cuba. McKinley had seen war and didn't like it. Neither did his predecessor in office, Grover Cleveland. Cleveland didn't want to get involved in Cuba and officially proclaimed America neutral. By the time McKinley took office in 1896, however, public opinion strongly favored American intervention. The newspaper accounts of the conflict became increasingly sensational, with large pictures of starving women and children in Cuba. Some journalists exaggerated the details and slanted the stories against Spain. One of the newspapers attempted to enlist the women of America to save the daughter of a Cuban leader who was deported to a Spanish prison colony. The most significant newspaper reports involved the explosion of the USS Maine on February 15, 1898. President McKinley had sent this battleship to Havana Harbor to protect American interests there. When the ship mysteriously exploded at anchor, many Americans blamed Spain and cried for war. McKinley didn't want to go to war. He had served in the Civil War and he knew what it was really like. But after the Maine blew up and further attempts at diplomacy failed, McKinley reluctantly gave in. In April of 1898, he approved a congressional resolution to order Spain to leave Cuba. Spain refused, and soon thereafter American soldiers were sent to Cuba and the Spanish-American War began. McKinley hated war, but Teddy Roosevelt was all for it. Roosevelt wanted the United States to be the world's superpower. He thought that America should be proactive, even aggressive, in pursuit of foreign empire. He supported the annexation of Hawaii, and he wanted America to free the Philippines. And of course, he wanted Cuba freed from Spain. Problem was, Teddy worked for President McKinley. He was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. When Congress declared war, Roosevelt resigned. He got permission to raise a voluntary cavalry regiment, mostly made up of Texans, who became known as Roosevelt's Rough Riders. Their moment of greatest glory came in Cuba, when they charged up San Juan Hill to take an important Spanish stronghold. It was the bloodiest battle of that little war. On July 1, 1898, 760 Spanish soldiers held the heights against American forces. The generals in charge were hesitant to attack this fortified position, but two groups of hot-blooded volunteers, including Roosevelt's Rough Riders, advanced anyway. The fighting was fierce. 3 times as many Americans died as Spaniards, but the Americans won the day and took the hill. From there, they laid siege to Santiago, their primary military objective in Cuba, which surrendered 2 weeks later. That effectively ended the war in Cuba. Roosevelt's exploits in the war made him a hero back home. The newspapers went wild. He was elected governor of New York, and then President McKinley picked him for vice president. McKinley's first vice president had died in office. McKinley and Roosevelt won the 1900 election, and when McKinley was gunned down by an anarchist in 1901, Roosevelt became president. We'll pick up his story at the start of year 4. The Spanish-American War was just one of 3 relatively small conflicts in this period. Fighting broke out in Asia and in Africa as well. In China, a group that called itself the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, known to Westerners as the Boxers, arose. The Chinese imperial dynasty was tottering, and the Boxers blamed Western religion and economic interference for its weakness. In a large-scale uprising during 1900, the Boxers sought to drive out foreigners. They slew many missionaries and other foreigners living in China and surrounded the compounds of others, holding them hostage. 500 Chinese Protestants were killed, and more than 18,000 Chinese Catholics. The West responded with force. Americans joined Germans, Japanese, Russians, and others who sent troops to China. Together, they freed the hostages in Beijing and defeated the Boxers. In Africa, the Boers, now called Afrikaners, fought the British for control of South Africa. There were 2 brief wars between them. The Second Boer War was the bloodier of the 2. It was there the British first established modern concentration camps to keep civilians under control while the soldiers searched for armed combatants. These camps were horribly mismanaged, and many of the Boer wives and children died from starvation or disease there. That helped break the will of the Boer resistance fighters, but it led to resentments that would shape and scar South Africa for generations. We'll see more concentration camps next year when we get to world wars. We're still setting the stage for year 4 of the 20th century. To that end, let's take one last look at German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who had almost single-handedly created a new German empire. After unifying Germany around his Kaiser, Bismarck's top priority was to keep it safe so it could grow. Bismarck's first step to protect Germany was to negotiate a set of treaties known as the Three Emperors League that united the interests of Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary. Their goal was to suppress insurrections at home and ward off foreign attacks. This plan ran into trouble when Russia beat the Turks in 1876 and gained control of major territory in the Balkans. For the first time, Russia had access to ports right on the Mediterranean Sea. That distressed the naval powers, France and Britain. Russia snubbed the Austrians by taking over lands the Austrians had wanted. Tensions rose, and war looked likely, and Bismarck did not want Germany to have to choose between Russia and Austria-Hungary if war broke out between them. So Bismarck started making treaties, first with Russia and Austria, then with Austria and Italy, then with Austria again, then with Russia again. It was all part of his plan to keep Germany out of war. The end product of Bismarck's machinations was a delicate balance of treaties that both involved and entangled European international relations. It wasn't that Bismarck was opposed to war, of course. He'd used his wars with Austria and France to build the empire. Bismarck was just opposed to losing. Let's end the story of the 19th century there, not with a neat conclusion that wraps it all up with a neat bow, but the cliffhanger ending that it really was. You see, we aren't at the end, but the beginning. Everything we've studied this year sets the stage for what is coming, the world that we've inherited, which we hand on to our children. May God enable us to learn from history and make us wise to understand our times.